Okay. So, how many people are there?
58 are there, sir. We can start.
Okay. So, shall we start?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can start.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Today we are going to discuss pulmonary hypertension. It's more of an overview and update. In fact, I plan to do this in 2 sessions. Today we'll just have an overview and update. Let's see what's going on in the field of pulmonary hypertension, and that's important to know current development, current guidelines, and so on. And of course, we'll have one more session on an interactive case discussion sort of thing with pulmonary hypertension, probably the next time. So, this is an overview, and the question remains why we want to do an overview and update session on pulmonary hypertension. This graph summarizes what has been happening in the field of pulmonary hypertension over the last 40-50 years. Most of it applies to idiopathic pulmonary arterial hypertension, but of course, a lot of it will also apply to pulmonary hypertension occurring in other conditions like congenital heart disease or lung disease and so on, connective tissue disorders, so on. But majority of the data is from idiopathic PAH, so that will form the first major part of my talk. We'll also discuss some things about other forms of hypertension, pulmonary hypertension. In general, idiopathic pulmonary hypertension in early 1970s and 1980s was called as primary pulmonary hypertension. Later on, the name was revised to idiopathic pulmonary hypertension because mainly because primary means it tells that there is no cause. Well, when you say idiopathic, you only mean that there has to be a cause, but we have not yet found it. So that's the difference. So idiopathic means that one day we will find the cause. Okay. So in the 1970s and 80s, or even before that, the prognosis of pulmonary arterial hypertension was very, very poor. In fact, once a patient that was diagnosed to have, generally they were diagnosed only after the onset of symptoms, and once symptoms came, the survival over 5 years was less than 25% survival. And those stages, the only aim of treatment was relief of symptoms, general supportive treatment, oxygen, and just keep the patient as comfortable as possible till he or she dies. And then in 1990s, calcium channel blockers were introduced. They were effective in a small percentage of cases. Intravenous prostacyclin was available, and it helped to sort of defer worsening and improve symptoms again. And again, it was a temporary measure, and it was thought it can only act as a bridge to transplant. So keep the patient alive till you get a transplant. Of course, this is not possible in most countries in the world. Then, of course, in the early 2000s, the specific anti-PAH drugs became available, like sildenafil, and then later on bosentan, and people started slowly using it. And somewhere around this time, we do not know whether it was a gentle treatment or whether the calcium channel blockers or mono, but the survival started improving. About 50% survival at 5 years. Yes. Then more and more drugs were introduced, and around that time, so from simple symptom relief, the drugs gave relief of symptoms and also improved the exercise capacity. Therefore, the quality of life improved. Around this time, the WHO and the Pulmonary Hypertension Society had a series of meetings in Dana Point and then Nice, and again another meeting in Nice. So where they formulated a new updated clinical classification and all, which we'll be discussing later. And then people thought, instead of using one drug, why not use 2 drugs together, sildenafil and bosentan together, or sildenafil plus something else together. Okay, give one drug, not much improvement, add another drug. And then more recently in 2015, the guideline came out that why don't we start 2 drugs or 3 drugs at this right at the beginning instead of waiting for worsening to happen. So survival is much better than before, but still it's not at 5 years, maybe 70% survive, but still it's not a cure. And therefore, the object now is to have new goals and have even longer survival than this. In effect, to produce a near cure for this. Yeah. Now, somewhere along the line, the goal of treatment also changed. Symptom relief, improved exercise capacity, and defer worsening. Then they realized that RV function was a critical thing because the way the patient died was increase in PVR and eventually right heart failure. So you have to control the PAH in order to preserve RV function. But if you want to really cure the patient, you have to bring down the PVR. Now, whether that's possible or not, we don't know. That's the ultimate goal. Bring down the pulmonary artery pressure and pulmonary vascular resistance to normal. That would be the ultimate goal. That would ensure long-term survival. So that graph shows you the entire history of pulmonary arterial hypertension over the last 50 years. Now you know why it's important to be aware of all these developments if you are to be a good cardiologist in 2020. Now there are the WHO classification was updated by the Nice DANA meeting, and then they updated again the Nice meeting, and this is the currently accepted classification by WHO, the Pulmonary Hypertension Society, as well as the European Cardiac Society. And even essentially most of the cases of pulmonary arterial hypertension which we will be dealing with, majority of them would fall into group 1. Group 1 is a pulmonary arterial hypertension. The large group among that would be idiopathic. The other important group that we would be is the congenital heart disease. Congenital heart disease. And of course, there are some lesser common conditions like a newborn period, HIV, connective tissue disorder, drug induced, and all that. But the major groups are idiopathic PAH and congenital heart disease, which is the one which we are going to discuss today. Now, pulmonary arterial hypertension is the most important. This is also known as precapillary pulmonary hypertension. This is the one which is the focus of attention as far as survival is concerned. Group 2 is pulmonary hypertension secondary to left heart disease, right? Left ventricular failure, mitral stenosis, mitral regurgitation, aortic regurgitation, and so on. By and large, pulmonary hypertension is an important factor in the morbidity and outcome of the patient. But if you treat the left heart disease successfully, this pulmonary hypertension is likely to reverse. In lung diseases, pulmonary hypertension is an important component, and often it may form the terminal event in chronic lung diseases, which is a separate problem to be discussed. Thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, again, is a completely separate factor. And of course, you have multifactorial cases where you have more than one mechanism happening, myeloid disorders, hematological disorders, metabolic disorders, so on and so forth. So this is currently, you must be aware of this classification. Of course, the most common pulmonary hypertension that you will be seeing will be the one due to left heart disease, one due to congenital heart disease, and idiopathic pulmonary arterial hypertension. Occasionally, you may see thromboembolic pulmonary arterial hypertension. There are various ways. What I told you was a clinical classification or clinico-etiological classification of pulmonary hypertension. There's a hemodynamic classification of pulmonary hypertension, and you must have heard of that. There's a pre-capillary and post-capillary. Of course, the definition of pulmonary arterial hypertension, all of you are aware, if the PA mean pressure is persistently elevated above 25 millimeters of mercury. When I say persistently, I mean there should be no reversible factor. Like if there's a respiratory infection or is a bronchial asthma or if there is a collapsed lung, the PA pressure will be high. That's not pulmonary hypertension. If no other aggravating factors, if the pulmonary artery pressure remains persistently high, it's definite pulmonary pulmonary hypertension. It's called precapillary when there is no evidence of pulmonary venous hypertension. It's purely a pulmonary arterial hypertension. Okay, in the absence of pulmonary venous hypertension, if the pulmonary artery pressure is higher. So the definition is PA pressure more than 25 and wedge pressure less than 15. Wedge pressure, or it could be left ventricular EDP less than 15. That's the definition of precapillary pulmonary hypertension. So before diagnosing idiopathic PAH, you have to show that PA pressure is elevated when the PA wedge pressure is normal. Examples are idiopathic PAH, lung disease, thromboembolic, etc. And post-capillary pulmonary hypertension is the one which typically occurs in left heart disease. So PA pressure more than 25, PA wedge pressure all more than 15. So the venous pressure is high. There is some element of obstruction. That's why the PA pressure is high. But then on top of it, there is arterial constriction. And therefore, you may have two levels of pulmonary hypertension. If you remember, when I talked about mitral stenosis, I told you that in mitral stenosis, you have one initial stage of pulmonary hypertension where there is a passive back pressure from the LA, pulmonary vein to pulmonary artery. So the PA pressure rises. But after some time, as the pulmonary hypertension persists, the PA arterioles become hypertrophied and constricted. Therefore, a second level of obstruction develops in the precapillary pulmonary arterioles. So the PA pressure rises even more. So there are two levels of obstruction. One is in the left heart and one is in the second stenosis at the pulmonary arteriole. Now, therefore, these two are separated out. If it is isolated post-capillary pulmonary hypertension, that is in the initial stages of left heart disease, you will find that the pulmonary vascular resistance is still low, normal. But at a later phase, when post-capillary pulmonary hypertension has caused pulmonary arteriolar constriction, you will have pulmonary arterial hypertension, we will have pulmonary venous hypertension, but the pulmonary vascular resistance will be high because there is a second stenosis. Okay, so you have precapillary pulmonary hypertension, you have post-capillary pulmonary hypertension. It could be isolated post-capillary or combined post-capillary and precapillary. Right? Examples of this is left heart disease. So that's the hemodynamic definition of pulmonary arterial hypertension. Of course, clinical staging of the disease is done for management purposes by the American Heart and the ACC, just like any other disease. Stage A is the one patients who are at risk of developing PAH, like people who have congenital heart disease, people who have had lung disease, but they have not actually developed pulmonary arterial hypertension. Stage B is they have developed pulmonary arterial hypertension, but still not severe and not symptomatic. Stage C is severe and asymptomatic. Stage D is severe and symptomatic. A clinico-etiological classification, you have a hemodynamic classification, and you have a clinical staging of the disease. Now, the important thing is most often pulmonary arterial hypertension of the idiopathic variety is diagnosed too late. Often they come only when they are symptoms, grade 2 or grade 3 symptoms. Secondly, when they have developed right heart failure, something, because the symptoms and signs are often very, very subtle in the initial stages. And they develop so gradually and insidiously that even the patient doesn't realize that his activity level is going down gradually. So, how to suspect PAH in a patient? In any patient who has got unexplained dyspnea, some activity he was doing earlier, but now he is finding it difficult to do. He will attribute it to gas, he will attribute it to age, he will attribute it to indigestion, he will attribute it to because he has not slept well and all that. But if persistently has exertional dyspnea, and in the absence of any physical evidence of heart or lung disease, one must look for pulmonary hypertension. If patient has a disease like he has got systemic hypertension or diabetes, but he has dyspnea which is out of proportion to the disease. Systemic hypertension is very mild, controlled on one tablet of amlodipine, but he is unable to climb a flight of stairs. So dyspnea out of proportion. There are certain conditions where you have to look for pulmonary hypertension, even if they don't complain of dyspnea, like congenital heart disease. Whenever you work up a congenital heart disease, you have to look for pulmonary hypertension. Any chronic lung disease, any case of portal hypertension, HIV, obesity, sleep apnea, deep vein thrombosis, all these conditions are there. Once you have diagnosed this condition, the next step, your diagnosis is incomplete if you have not looked for pulmonary arterial hypertension. And of course, occasionally you do come across incidental finding, like they went for a medical checkup and they found an abnormal ECG or an abnormal X-ray, they had an echo for some other reason, and they found an abnormal echo. So they may present with one of these X-rays. They may have classical dilated main pulmonary artery, a huge right pulmonary artery, and peripheral arteries are very thin and pruned out. So it may be in this phase. Or the X-ray may look very, very mildly abnormal, just a little bulge of the main pulmonary artery segment. Lung field looking relatively normal, but still it's not entirely normal. Patient is having breathlessness and he has a slightly prominent main pulmonary artery. You cannot find any other reason for it. You have to look for pulmonary hypertension. Of course, you have cardiomegaly, right? But so any such X-ray should prompt you to look for evidence of pulmonary arterial hypertension. Many of my slides have been taken from the European Cardiac Society. So that's the latest, which has been updated in 2017. So 2015 and again an short update in 2017. So they are given very simple diagnostic algorithms based on the common causes. So once you suspect or you want to rule out pulmonary arterial hypertension, the first thing is to do an echocardiogram. The echocardiogram is the after clinical examination, the echo is probably the best clue to diagnose pulmonary arterial hypertension. Now, what are the echocardiographic features of pulmonary hypertension? That's entirely a separate topic. I'm not going to discuss into it. You must know exactly what, because even in echo, you may not find all the signs in a given patient. And therefore, there are about 8 or 10 findings, out of which even if 1 or 2 are positive, immediately you must start working up further for pulmonary. Because pulmonary arterial hypertension is one of the most difficult things to diagnose. If there is TR and if there is bulging pulmonary artery on the X-ray and all, it's very easy. But that is too late for diagnosis. You want to diagnose it at a stage when you can do something better. Therefore, at an early stage, you have to look for very subtle echo sign. And we will discuss echo findings sometime, but you have to read up all those findings. Now, one of the first and foremost important thing to rule out is left heart disease and lung disease, because these are the easiest things to rule out. Left heart disease by simple auscultation, by simple ECG, doing stress test, looking at the left heart in the echocardiogram, doing lung function test, looking at the chest X-ray for the lung field and so on, or CT chest for the lung field, blood gases. Very easy to rule out or confirm left heart disease. Therefore, if you have a high suspicion, spend time and energy to rule out left heart disease and lung diseases. But if you think you have the causes of left heart are very unlikely, then of course you have to follow up for other causes. We'll come back to that. So, do you think left heart disease, lung disease is concerned? If there are none, the next step is to rule out thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension. So there you do either CT pulmonary angiogram or look for a VQ scan for perfusion defects. So the algorithm is very simple. Once you think there is pulmonary hypertension and confirm it by echo, first rule out left heart disease, look for lung diseases. If neither of them are there, look for thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, because these are the ones which can be treated. No, these are treatable disease. Left heart is treatable, lung disease treatable, thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension is treatable. Okay. If you find a cause, you obviously treat the cause. If at any point you find that the pulmonary hypertension is so severe that the RV is already failing, then of course he needs a expert center. So then you cannot manage it at any ordinary hospital. So left heart disease, lung disease, and thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension are the ones which need to be ruled out first. Once you have done thromboembolic disease by the CT or BQ scan, you have not found any cause. Of course, congenital heart disease would be ruled out at the echo stage itself. In that case, you probably need to do a right heart cath and confirm the severity and presence of pulmonary arterial hypertension. And from there on, you may have to work up in more detail for collagen disease, for any history of drugs, HIV, cystosome, so on, and all that. Okay, so that's the whole thing. Approach to a diagnostic algorithm for pulmonary arterial hypertension. Now, at every stage, especially in an adult, you must make sure there is no left heart disease. It's so easy to miss mitral stenosis, miss diastolic heart failure, miss restrictive heart disease on the left side. Very often the patient presents just with pulmonary arterial hypertension and are diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary arterial hypertension, and a little effort to work up will reveal that the patient has left heart disease. So we must always be on the lookout for group 2 pulmonary arterial hypertension because a lot of them are treatable. Now, what is the clinical clues to group 2 pulmonary arterial hypertension? Group 2 means left heart disease. Elderly patient. Elderly patient presenting in pulmonary hypertension because most idiopathic PA, thromboembolic and all to come relatively early, young adults to middle age. So age above 65, obvious signs of left heart failure or symptoms of heart failure. If the patient has metabolic syndrome or obesity, if he has a previous history of heart disease, and if he is in atrial fibrillation. These are the clinical clues to suggest that he may have left heart disease as a cause of pulmonary arterial hypertension. In the echo, you can diagnose pulmonary arterial hypertension, but look for subtle evidence that the LA is enlarged or the atrial septum is slightly bowing to the right, indicating LA enlargement. The LV is not grossly abnormal, but slightly systolic dysfunction, or the LV wall looks a little thickened. LV mass looks a little big. Or maybe everything looks normal until you do the diastolic indices, and there may be some evidence of diastolic dysfunction. Unless you look very carefully for diastolic dysfunction, you may totally miss it. And of course, if you have pulmonary arterial hypertension, but the RV looks entirely normal, then you must also suspect that maybe it's all left-sided disease. Of course, ECG, other evidences like abnormal ECG and will draw your attention left heart disease, LVB, left ventricular hypertrophy, so on. And of abnormal X-ray, again, if you see pulmonary venous hypertension or LA enlargement, always be careful that you have not missed left heart disease. It's not very common in India, but abroad, many of these drugs have been blamed for pulmonary arterial hypertension, and you must be aware of this. There are certain drugs which have been definitely associated with development of PAH, weight-losing drugs, aminorex, fenfluramine, and then selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The use of SSRI for relief of anxiety and depression is very, very common nowadays. In fact, SSRI is a very important group of drugs for psychiatric use, and often patients take these drugs for years and years. They have been definitely associated with the risk of developing pulmonary hypertension. Of course, drug abuse, amphetamines and methamphetamines definitely have been shown, and these are possible associations, especially chemotherapeutic agents in the treatment of malignancy. Now, once you have diagnosed pulmonary hypertension and you have a cause or you don't have a cause, the most important thing is to do a risk assessment. Now, this is an important step in almost every field of cardiology, whether it is ischemic heart disease or whether it's mitral valve disease or it is coronary artery disease, risk assessment. And you have to separate them into low risk, intermediate risk or high risk. The reason is earlier the approach was you treat symptoms, and if it doesn't improve, you step up the treatment. That was the approach. But in that process, it was found that very often you lose the chance to cure the disease. Like for example, in a valve disease, the patient is listening, you give diuretic, he feels better. So you don't do anything for the valve. Over a period of time, the LV becomes dysfunctional. And then even if you replace the valve, it doesn't improve. So you have to identify the high risk group at a very early stage, and instead of trying medical treatment and step by step treatment, you go straight away to the aggressive treatment. So that is the purpose of risk assessment. Should you start with ordinary treatment and gradually step up, or you consider the patient a very high risk and therefore you go straight away to the most aggressive treatment? So what do you mean by low risk? If the 5-year mortality, no, sorry, 1-year mortality is less than 5%, it's called low risk. That is, if 1-year mortality is less than 5% in a diagnosed case of PAH, it's called low risk. 5 to 10% mortality in a year is called intermediate risk. And more than 10% risk mortality in the first year after diagnosis is called high risk. So you have to separate, you have to identify, put the patient in one of these boxes, the low risk box or the moderate risk box or the high risk box. So how do you do that? Look for signs of right heart failure. Whether the symptoms are increasing rapidly. I mean, if for last 10 years he has been class 2 symptom, that is different from patient who developed symptoms 6 months ago and rapidly increasing to class 3. If he has syncopal episode, functional class. So obviously if you have syncopal episode, rapid progression, signs of right heart failure, they go into the high risk category. Class 1 and 2 go to low risk, class 3 comes here, class 4 comes here. A 6-minute walk test. I hope all of you are familiar with 6-minute walk test. It's a very, very important test in any chronic heart disease, especially idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. And you must read up everything about it, how to do it. The test has to be done in a very, very specific, standardized fashion. You can't just say, I walk for 6 minutes and come back and tell me how you feel. That is not the way it is done. Please read about it. I'm not going to talk about it now. But if the performance on 6-minute walk test is more than 40 meters, it's a low risk. Between 160 to 440 meters considered as intermediate risk, and very severely restricted activity indicates high risk. Now, 6-minute walk test can be asked as a short note, as a in theory paper also. You could be asked in clinical examination also. Please read up. If it's available, you could do a formal cardiopulmonary testing and grade the exercise capacity. Pro BNP levels are very important, normal, mildly elevated and markedly elevated levels. Imaging for RV function or RA size. So if RA is normal and no pericardial effusion, mild RA is and minimal pericardial effusion, and RA is markedly dilated large pericardial effusion. These are all high risk. Hemodynamics. RA pressure less than 8, good cardiac output. RA pressure is elevated, mild drop in cardiac output, and severely elevated RA pressure, severely decreased cardiac output. So you separate the patient low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk. The low risk patients will go on a initial protocol, whereas the high risk patient will go straight away on a more aggressive protocol. That's the whole idea. Now, whenever you are asked in the examination about management of pulmonary arterial hypertension, invariably the students will start, I'll start him on a one sildenafil group of drugs and one bosentan, and they straight away go to the targeted therapy. Now that's the last thing which the examiner wants. He wants to know you are dealing with a live patient and you have to approach the patient in a humane and normal fashion. First thing is to offer him supportive management. First of all, you have to explain to him what is pulmonary arterial hypertension, what it means for him, and what is the expected outcome. Is he a low risk category or a high risk category? And depending on that, first of all, counsel him well to explain. It's very important to advise him on lifestyle, because he doesn't know what activity he can undertake, what will aggravate his disease, and what will improve his disease. So you have to give him lifestyle advice. He is concerned whether he can go to work, whether he can go do the present job that he is doing, and so on. Everything. It's very important that you should not restrict his activities too much. Whatever his activity his patient is able to do, he should continue. And in fact, he should put on a supervised, structured training program, because gradually training definitely improves the effort tolerance of these patients, and that very much helps to keep up the cardiac output and the morale of the patient. And of course, there's a whole bunch of common general advice you have to take care of. You have to advise ladies on how to avoid pregnancy, because last time we discussed pregnancy definitely is a contraindication for pulmonary arterial hypertension. You have to advise them on the mode of contraception. You have to advise them about surgery, because surgery and anesthesia is a very high risk in the presence of severe PAH, and they are not good candidates for general anesthesia. Therefore, if possible, should be done under the epidural anesthesia. Surgery should be avoided as much as possible. If at all it has to be done carefully with proper hemodynamic monitoring, proper support, treatment of respiratory infections, proper immunization. Even adults need immunizations against the flu, against the pneumovac, and other common infections. Often now people travel as part of work, as part of holidays and all, whether they can travel, they can go in flight, whether they can go to a high altitude, and of course any aggravating factors like anemia. Now, these are the first steps in management, and you have to talk about this first before you go on to targeted treatment. A number of medications are used, and these are some of the medications which you invariably find on prescriptions in our country. The diuretics and dioxins are often prescribed. Yes, they have a role when the patient has developed right heart failure and he has accumulated fluid, but in the absence of heart failure, dioxin and diuretic does not have any role. Very often patients are given vasodilators, hydralazine, ACE inhibitors, enalapril, captopril, and all that. Vasodilators of these varieties have no role in the treatment of pulmonary arterial hypertension. Anticoagulation has a role if you suspect thromboembolic pulmonary arterial hypertension. But even in other forms of pulmonary hypertension, the pulmonary artery is very dilated. There is a tendency to spontaneous thrombosis, and therefore, or a patient is in right heart failure, it can develop venous thrombosis, and therefore anticoagulation definitely has a role. Hematinics help to maintain the hematocrit, and therefore ensure that a limited cardiac output is able to deliver adequate oxygen to the tissues. Now, continuous oxygen inhalation may be indicated if the patient is not able to maintain normal PO2. In the absence of hypoxia, giving oxygen has no role. If the patient is hypoxic, if his PO2 is persistently low, in that case, continuous administration of oxygen definitely helps to relieve his hypoxia, in turn, which helps to relieve the pulmonary vasoconstriction. So once you have done these general measures and all, it's time to look at the specific or targeted pulmonary arterial hypertension drugs. Now, all of you are familiar with the drugs available, and if you are not familiar, better time to become very familiar with this. And all of you must have seen this figure in books and slides and everywhere. The drugs used for pulmonary arterial hypertension can act on three main pathways: the endothelial cell pathway, the nitric oxide pathway, and prostacyclin pathway. These are the three main mechanisms which help to keep the pulmonary vessels, in fact, any vessel in the body, but now here we are talking about pulmonary vessel, they keep the blood vessels dilated and healthy. So the endothelin pathway acts through the endothelium, and they act through the endothelin receptor. We have two types of receptors, and the drugs which can block these endothelin help to dilate the pulmonary arterioles. So you have endothelin receptor blockers in the form of bosentan, ambrisentan, and macitentan. Now, all three are available in India. Nitric oxide pathway is the one which produces nitric oxide in the endothelium, which in turn dilates the vessel. Nitric oxide acts through the cyclic GMP pathway and this pathway can be influenced by two types of drugs. The most common one is the phosphodiesterase inhibitor, examples of sildenafil and tadalafil. It 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 inhibits this enzyme which breaks down cyclic GMP. This enzyme helps to break down cyclic GMP. When you give sildenafil or tadalafil, it prevents the breakdown of cyclic GMP, therefore cyclic GMP is increased. On the other hand, you have another drug called riociguat, which help to stimulate the production of cyclic GMP. So they're acting at two different sites. The importance of knowing this site of action is that you can make logical combination of drugs. For example, you cannot combine sildenafil with tadalafil because they act by the same mechanism at the same point. There's absolutely no point in combining the sildenafil with tadalafil. What you would rather do is you can use sildenafil here, one drug here, and a drug like riociguat. You can do that, or you can combine the PD5 inhibitor with a endothelin receptor blocker, or you can combine these two with a prostacyclin drug. So this is the second nitric oxide pathway. And third is the prostacyclin pathway. From arachidonic acid you get prostacyclin, and the prostacyclin acts on receptors here to produce cyclic AMP. So the sildenafil group acts on cyclic GMP, this acts on cyclic AMP, guanosine monophosphate and adenosine monophosphate. Now here there are two groups of drugs. You can use prostacyclin and prostacyclin-like drugs to stimulate these receptors, IP2 receptors, or you can use a synthetic drug to stimulate it. Example is selexipag, which recently underwent a trial and called, you must have heard the Griffon trial. So now many of the drugs, almost all of these drugs are available except these intravenous prostacyclins and treprostinil. This group of drugs is still not available here. These drugs, this has become recently available, and all these are available. Selexipag is also available, although with some difficulty. So you must be familiar with this diagram and with this group of drugs. So the treatment is charted out. The European Society has made a very simple algorithm, which is, remember, and it's a very useful way to start treatment. First of all, you must suspect, we take a patient who is not on treatment and you confirm that he has indeed pulmonary arterial hypertension. Once you have done that, you start general measures and supportive treatment. If you remember, my first slide on treatment showed all those general measures and supportive treatment. Once you have done that to relieve the patient's symptoms, they recommend an acute vasoreactivity test. I will come to that a little later, because one of the important purposes of vasoreactivity test is to identify patients who will respond to calcium channel blockers like nifedipine. Therefore, acute vasoreactivity test is recommended to identify patients for calcium channel blocker, but that's only a very small group, maybe about 10% of the patient. 90% of the patient will not show any reactivity. In case of idiopathic PH, will not show any reactivity to calcium channel blockers, and therefore they have to go on to a subsequent mode of treatment. Now that is where your risk stratification comes in. If you have a low risk category or intermediate risk category, you have the choice of starting one drug, either sildenafil or tadalafil, or in that group, or you can start bosentan or one of the prostacyclin. Any one drug you can start with the monotherapy. But more and more publications are coming that even as the first therapy, you could start a two-drug combination. So for a low-risk category, you start with a monotherapy, or in some cases with a combination therapy of two drugs. Whereas the high-risk category goes off into separate drug, where you start straight away with a combination therapy of two oral drugs with intravenous prostate. Now this option is not available to us in India. Now, so you have, our choice is only to decide between monotherapy or a combination therapy. If you are in the center where you can do this, you straight away go on to 3 drugs or more, including an intravenous prostacyclin. If the patient is showing inadequate response to one drug or two drug or aggressive three plus treatment, they go on to more aggressive medical treatment. If they only one drug, you add the other two or three drugs. If they're already on three drugs, they go on to more aggressive forms of treatment. Now, when I say more aggressive forms of treatment, the only ultimate treatment for idiopathic PAH who is unresponsive to medication and having progressive deterioration is lung transplant. That's the only treatment available. But between aggressive medical treatment and lung transplant, you can do some more aggressive treatment in the form of continuous prostacyclin infusion. You can do atrial septostomy to relieve the right heart pressures so that it decompresses into the left heart. And in some cases, people are even attempting a attempt to do a aortopulmonary communication, just like atrial septostomy to create a communication from right side to left side. People are attempting a aortopulmonary like a partition. Connect the aorta to the pulmonary artery. Therefore, when the pulmonary artery pressure rises too much, it decompresses into the aorta, and although there will be desaturation in the aorta, still the PA pressure will not rise to a very high level. Of course, around the time that you consider the patient is becoming refractory, the patient is already registered for a transplant program. That is the ideal management. Now, I have highlighted the important steps in this management algorithm. First, you need to confirm and rule out any correctable cause. Then you do general and supportive measures, and then you do a vasoreactivity test. If you have, then you do a risk stratification. Low risk go on to one drug or two drugs. High, if they don't respond or if they are already in a high risk category, like patients already having syncopal episode, already in right heart failure, already having a low cardiac output, already in class 4, they straight away go to 3 drugs or 4 drugs. Immediately they go on to the transplant waiting list. If there is still some delay, try balloon septostomy and or prostacyclin infusion, and that would be the approach. So the encircled ones here are all the important steps in this management. Now, when you give a drug, you have to know what is the target you are trying to do. That means you give sildenafil 25 milligram 3 times a day, and then what? You forget about him. You have to have some target. You have to know how to know whether your drug is working or you cannot be doing cardiac cath every month or every 3 months to know whether the PA pressures come down. So you have to know. Therefore, this is called, you have to treat to a target. Your treatment should produce some target. If that target is not achieved, that means your drug is not effective. If a patient is class 3, you give sildenafil, and if he's still in class 3, that means it's not effective. You have to move on. You cannot just continue that and wait for things to deteriorate. So it is called treat to target strategy. So you can have functional, if he is class 3 or class 4, he must come back to class 1 or class 2. If he has echo or CMRI evidence of RV enlargement, the RV should come back to normal or it should reduce in size. If you have done a hemodynamic study, the cardiac index should improve. If you have done 6-minute walk test, 6-minute walk test for 150 meters, you should improve to 350 meters or 380 meters. Or if BNP was elevated, you should move towards normal. So you have to achieve certain targets in these parameters before you can call your treatment as effective. This is called treat to target strategy. You don't just blindly give a prescription and then forget about the patient. You have to continuously follow up and see that these targets are achieved. Because if you don't achieve the target, that means you will come back in a much worse shape. Now, what are the things you see in a follow-up of a patient? Now, follow-up can be done at various intervals. These are the European recommendations. They recommend every 3 to 6 months certain tests, every 6 to 12 months certain other tests, and then so on and so forth. And that includes clinical assessment, ECG, 6 minutes walk test, CT pulmonary angio at the beginning and in case of worsening, echocardiogram being one of the most commonly done follow-up tests, BSP levels, blood gas and so on. And whenever necessary, right heart cath is done. So that's the only way you can get a precise calculation of pulmonary vascular resistance. Now, but all of them is not possible in our country in all the centers, and definitely not possible on a continuous basis every 3 months for the rest of the patient's life. A practical approach is that what we can do is functional class assessment, chart it continuously in the patient's case sheet. A serial 6-minute walk test. 6-minute walk test doesn't cost anything. You can do it and chart it every visit. You do a 6-minute walk test, a screening echo just for RV function, and just the BNP level. These 4 parameters itself will tell you whether the patient is deteriorating or is stationary or is improving. Now, mind you, staying stationary is not acceptable. That's one point you must understand. The RV is impaired, and with treatment it remains the same. That is not acceptable. It has to improve. If it's remaining the same, it is considered as it is becoming worse. So remaining the same and becoming worse is the same as far as PAH treatment is concerned. Are you people hearing?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes.
Unfortunately, this is entirely one-sided talk, and I don't even know what whether you guys are following.
No, sir, it's very helpful, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay. Right.
Yes.
So this is what happened when they started treating with drugs. So initially, you know, the mortality was almost 70% or 75% at the end of 5 years. You know, the initial graphs were all somewhere here, and then sildenafil and prostin came, and one single drug was being used, and then the survival improved. So a lot of papers were written that survival improved from 30% to 60% here, like this. That was a great jump, and everybody was very happy. And then bosentan and some more drug came, and then some combination therapy was used, and then the reveal registry here, the mortality in 5 years has improved to almost 70%. From 70% mortality, it has come down to 70% survival. That's wonderful. Everybody was happy. But then the patient, when he was diagnosed, was only 20 years, and now it is 25 years old. Is that what you want? At 25 years, you are happy that he survived. Come on, he has another 50 years to go in life. So now, what happened after following these patients for another 5 years? Can you see this? All the monotherapy, gradually the survival keeps on going, and eventually, instead of at 5 years, at 10 years, it comes down to 35%. So what is happening is all your monotherapy or 2 drugs therapy or your general treatment does improve survival, but this is short-lived benefit. If you follow the patient beyond 5 years, it's still a downward curve, and in about 10 years time, the survival is close to 30% or 35%. Almost 70% of the people have died again. Earlier 70% were dying at 5 years, now 70% are dying at 10 years. That's the only difference. So that's not much, because most of these patients are very, very young, in the early 20s or 30s. So I think people thought in that practice or something was not okay with our treatment, or our treatment was not aggressive enough. What we should see actually is you should see a curve somewhat like this. Now, one of the reasons which people attributed to why you are following it up is this was following the earlier passive mode of follow. That is, you start a drug, the patients feel better, and then you keep continuing the drug until the patient feels worse. That is, the monitoring of the treatment was entirely done by symptoms based, and it was not done by objective monitoring. So staying stationary was considered as good enough. Now, staying stationary and stable is not considered good enough. Then you have to treat more aggressively. That is the time you can expect improvement in RV function and long-term survival. So the Japanese authors in 2014 onward, they have come up with the concept that you have to aggressively treat enough to improve the RV function and bring down the PVR. So what is the real goal? The real goal is just relief of symptoms. See, if you remember my first graph of history of pulmonary hypertension, initially we thought we'll relieve symptoms, good, we have done a great job. Then we thought the patient is able to walk more and go to his office for 2 years, great, we have done a great job. Then we thought we saw a patient survival at 5 years has improved, that is then it found that 10 years it has improved, but that's not enough. What we really want is we have to bring back his survival to normal. And how can you do that? You have to bring back the PA pressure and PVR to normal. Therefore, the real goal is not absence of worsening. The real goal is PVR should come to normal and RV should come back to normal and remain normal. Now, so there is a paper from the Japanese authors in which they are very, very, very aggressive about treatment. Even once the diagnostics done, even the intermediate risk patient are started off on a very aggressive treatment of 3 to 5 drugs at the same time. All of them include one bosentan-like drug, one sildenafil-like drug, riociguat, and intravenous administration of prostacyclin. All of these are important, and the intravenous infusion is titrated continuously in the hospital to get maximum reduction in the PVR, enough to gradually bring down the PVR pressure. And with such very aggressive treatment in a small group of patients, they have been able to show that even in idiopathic PAH, at the end of 5 years, the mortality curve is very similar to the normal population. Mind you, this is not an accepted, commonly achievable form of treatment. This is in a very selected group, in a small group of patients, only 50 patients, and they followed up for about 4 years, and they found that the mortality was only about 10% as compared to about 25% in all other protocols here. So the concept is changing. If you want long-term survival, you have to be very, very aggressive right from here. Monitor the patient. If the RV and PVR is not improving, keep on step up the drug continuously, so that you have able to bring down the PVR to the maximum level possible and achieve a better survival. That is the ultimate goal. This has not come into the guidelines yet, but it could be possible that in the next set of guidelines may be arrived. At the moment, we have to classify them into low risk. We go on monotherapy. Intermediate risk go on 2 drugs therapy. The high risk category straight away go on 3 drugs therapy. If any of these patients are not improving, then they go on to additional drug therapy and then go on to more invasive therapy. Now, the initial drug combination, earlier people used to use commonly sildenafil plus bosentan, and a number of studies have been done, but the only combination which has actually been proved in a randomized study and which has entered the guideline is a combination of ambrisentan and tadalafil. So this is the only combination which has found a class 1 indication in the functional class 2 and class 3 for idiopathic PAH, the class 1 indication. Therefore, if you have idiopathic PAH patient with function class 2 to class 3, if you want to follow the guideline, the initial drug therapy would be a combination of ambrisentan and tadalafil and not any other. This is the only drug which has been proven by a double-blind controlled trial. Now, but if you can extrapolate this, probably other drugs also will have a similar effect. Because ambrisentan has this effect, probably bosentan should have a similar effect. So probably a combination of bosentan and sildenafil or bosentan plus tadalafil should probably have the same effect. But these combinations are all given a class 2 approval, whereas ambrisentan and tadalafil is probably the only combination which has been given class 1 approval. Now, once the patient has been started on one drug or two drugs, the next drug should be a drug which acts on a different site. For example, if you have used one the PD inhibitor like sildenafil, and you have used one endothelin receptor blockers as ambrisentan, in that case, the drug to be added would be either prostacyclin, or you would have a drug which acts on cyclic AMP like not cyclic, the riociguat. So you should not combine two drugs from the same category of these patients. So the logical combinations would be ambrisentan, tadalafil, that is a PD inhibitor with an endothelin blocker, or if you want to add three drugs, should be bosentan, sildenafil, and a prostin. Or somewhere in this, it's not been shown here, you can add riociguat to one of these. No. Now this can be, it can be used as an upfront combination in severe patient, or you can add a sequential drug. So you start one or two drugs and then you add another drug. So that is called sequential. So you have a combination upfront therapy, you have got a combination sequential therapy. Again, the one which is approved is macitentan to sildenafil. More recently, riociguat and bosentan has also been approved for sequential, not upfront combination, but a sequential drug therapy. Of course, you can, a lot more combinations are being tried now, like bosentan, prostin, ambrisentan, sildenafil, tadalafil, bosentan, and any combination are being tried. Many of these combinations will probably prove effective, but at the moment we have evidence only for these two combinations. Right. So that is an update about, I didn't go into the more invasive forms of treatment of septostomy and the transplant, because I don't think you're expected to know that. Let's now look at a few slides of congenital pulmonary arterial hypertension. Now, congenital heart disease developing pulmonary arterial hypertension is a distinct category, and it's got very clear differences from idiopathic PAH. For example, in idiopathic PAH, we don't know what triggers it. Whereas in congenital heart disease, we know what triggers it. We know that the large flow through the lungs triggers it. Therefore, the aim is always to remove the trigger. In congenital heart disease, we know the trigger is a VSD. So we have to close the VSD. That's the thing. Idiopathic PAH, we don't know the cause. Therefore, we cannot remove the cause. All of them, the arteries look similar. The arterial proliferation looks similar. But the initiating cause is different. The proliferation is in idiopathic PAH, it's entirely monoclonal. One set of genetic multiplication takes place called monoclonal, whereas the proliferation in congenital heart disease, pulmonary hypertension is often polyclonal. Idiopathic PAH often presents late to us because it's very, very gradual. But once it develops symptoms, it progresses very rapidly unless you treat it aggressively. Whereas congenital heart disease PAH was tolerated very well. Probably because the RV is used to high pressure right from early days, and probably because the hole, if it remains, it provides a pop off so that the RV pressure can decompress in the LV, and therefore the RV doesn't go into decompensation. Therefore, rapid worsening is a feature of idiopathic PAH. Long periods of stability is a feature of congenital disease pulmonary hypertension. When they develop symptoms, congenital heart disease main problem is hypoxia, not heart failure. Whereas the main problem in idiopathic PAH is heart failure. In case of congenital heart disease, if you repair it, you prevent the PAH from progressing. Whereas in idiopathic PAH, we do not have any such corrective measure. So there are major differences between congenital heart disease and idiopathic PAH. But when you look at the histology of PAH in congenital heart disease and idiopathy, there's not much to choose between. You cannot identify from the histology whether it's secondary to pulmonary artery, the idiopathic PAH, or it is due to congenital heart disease. Now, in the setting of pulmonary arterial hypertension, clinically, you can have four categories of pulmonary hypertension. One is the classical Eisenmenger syndrome. Now, Eisenmenger syndrome can have a clinical definition, which is a classical original definition of Eisenmenger and Paulwood. It is a communication between the two sides of the heart, that is a septal defect with marked elevation of pulmonary arterial pressures and a reversal of shunt across the defect, producing cyanosis. So the definition is a cyanotic condition produced by a reversal of shunt due to severe pulmonary arterial hypertension. That is the clinical definition. Whereas a hemodynamic definition would be a septal defect with pulmonary vascular disease causing increase in PVR to systemic levels, or irreversible increase in PVR to systemic levels. Irreversible increase in PVR to systemic level. There is a, not everybody becomes Eisenmenger syndrome on day one. No? There is a phase before Eisenmenger syndrome, and that is the stage where congenital heart disease has PAH, and earlier it is correctable, later on it becomes irreversible. You can have another category of patient in whom somebody went and closed the VSD, but he still has PAH. Okay, so operated CHD with persistent PAH. And finally, you can have a patient with severe PAH who also has a small ASD. Now, one doesn't know whether to close this ASD or not, whether this PAH is due to the ASD or not, or is it a simple bystander. So these are the four common categories of congenital heart disease with pulmonary arterial hypertension. Now, congenital heart disease, pulmonary vascular disease has certain features. Is almost always initially it is associated with large shunt, large pulmonary blood flow. It has a variable age of onset depending on the type of disease. For example, if you have a very complex heart disease like transposition or DIVA RV, they develop PAH in the first year of life. Or AV canal defect, they develop pulmonary hypertension very early in life. But if you have a ASD, you may not develop pulmonary hypertension till 40 years of age. If you have a VSD, you may develop pulmonary hypertension by 10 to 20 years or 5 to 10 years. So it is a variable age of onset. It always increases with age. As age increases, the pulmonary vascular disease increases. However, it varies. For some reason, it varies. Some patients it progresses very rapidly, some patients it progresses gradually, and it's hard to predict in which patient it will go. Probably there are other etiological factors like genetic tendencies, environmental factors which act along with the congenital heart disease and therefore decides the rate of progression. If you have a patient with large pulmonary blood flow and hypoxia, pulmonary hypertension is very likely. There is an initial reversible stage followed by an irreversible stage later. Once pulmonary vascular disease is established, surgery has a high mortality, and if you operate and you come out of it, they still have a high incidence of late morbidity and mortality. In fact, if you close the VSD or ASD in a patient who has got severe pulmonary vascular disease, his prognosis is much worse than Eisenmenger syndrome. Mind you, these are the usual pattern of pulmonary vascular disease in congenital heart disease, but more often than not, patients are not aware of this rule, so they break the rule. Therefore, you can have a patient developing PAH very early in an ASD, or you can have a very complex heart disease and at 30 years and still not develop pulmonary vascular disease. Therefore, although these are the usual pattern, very often they break the rule. Now, very early in 1950s and 60s itself, people showed that as the age advances, the probability of a surgical correction decreases. And natural history, the probability of surgical cure decreases as age advances. If a congenital heart disease is operated in the first year of life, you have maximum possibility of surgical cure. Cure means you close the defect and the pulmonary pressure come back to normal and survival becomes normal. The later you operate, the less is the probability of cure. The natural history, if you don't do anything, again, after the first year, the prognosis becomes quite bad, and survival is progressively less. And very few patients with congenital heart disease survive beyond the uh, survive. A prognosis is good after a long period. Now, if you calculate PVR and the probability of successful repair, you find once the PVR increases beyond 6 to 8 units, the probability of late death after surgery increases. So once it crossed 8 units, the probability, even you may be able to operate and get away with the operation, but eventually he will deteriorate and die, and therefore the probability of death is high if the PVR is less than 8. Therefore, when the PVR has gone up beyond a certain limit, you don't offer surgical repair. This was an elegant study. There were many studies like that. This is one of the earliest ones which showed that Eisenmenger patients have surprisingly very good survival. Even though they are diagnosed somewhere in the first decade or second decade of life, they often have quite a normal survival for about 3 to 4 decades. They die maybe in third or fourth or fifth decade. Otherwise, the first 1 or 2, 3 decades, they have a reasonably stable life. And therefore, the survival curve is almost flat. On the other hand, if you go and close the VSD in a patient who has got pulmonary vascular disease, look at this dotted line here, post-operative. That is, if you have pulmonary hypertension, but the surgeon was thought then, no, if I close the VSD, PAH will come down, and he went and closed it. The mortality is very high, and at the end of 5 years, almost 70% have died. Therefore, the message here is, if you have pulmonary vascular disease, it's better to leave the VSD or ASD open. Don't close the ASD or VSD if you think the pulmonary arterial hypertension is significant. That's the most dangerous things to do. In fact, the survival is so bad that it is worse than even lung diseases or connective tissue disorders. That's one of the biggest mistakes that you can do is in a patient with VSD or ASD PAH, you're going to close the defect. Many attempts have been made to grade the pulmonary vascular disease so that you decide, okay, this histology I will operate, this histology I won't operate. So you must have heard of the Heath and Edward classification. If you have not heard of it, please read it, because the examiners sometimes ask at least you must have a rough idea of what this is. So different degrees of arterial changes. There's another one by Rabinovich. Okay, but this was a very simplified description of the histology in the. Later on, they found that it is rarely the changes are not restricted to the artery. There are numerous changes even elsewhere in the lung. Every tissue in the lung is abnormal. The arterial hypertrophy would be changed, but in addition, the endothelium is also proliferated. The artery shows necrosis and inflammation. There is blockage of the venules. The capillaries are abnormal. There's interstitial edema. The lymphatics are swollen. There's a lot of hemosiderin deposits and fibrosis. And in addition, there's always an element of thrombosis in the artery. So the histology is not as simple as it was thought initially. Initially, it was thought it was simply an arterial disease. But now it's believed that it's much more extensive, and most of the tissues in the lungs are affected. And it has been consistently shown in many papers that doing a biopsy has absolutely no use in determining operability. So if you are doubtful if a patient should be operated, don't think a biopsy is going to help you or a lung histology is going to help you. That's the most misleading thing. You can have a favorable histology until the patient could have a bad result, or the other way around. Therefore, people started doing some other way of testing whether the patient can be operated or not. In fact, this vasoreactivity test I briefly mentioned in idiopathic PAH also. This was first developed in idiopathic PAH, not for congenital heart disease. So, and it was called reactivity test. I am discussing it with congenital heart disease because there are slight differences in the reactivity test, the way you do it for idiopathic PAH and the way you do it for congenital heart disease. Therefore, why do you do a vasoreactivity test? Initial phases, the only agents for treatment we had was calcium channel blockers before all these newer drugs came, and a small group of patients responded very well to calcium channel blocker. So they wanted a mechanism of predicting which patient will respond to calcium channel blocker. Now this test was done, and they gave a vasodilator and did a complete hemodynamic study. It helped to stratify the patient in the risk. Now the criteria for positivity was different people use different criteria. The PA mean pressure fell by 10 millimeters of mercury, and the absolute PA mean pressure came down to less than 40 with no change in cardiac output. Other people use fall in pulmonary resistance by 20%, or if you give a drug and then withdraw it, the PVR increased by 10% on withdrawal. Another criteria we use was fall in PVR by 20% and no change in systemic pressure. So these are different criteria which we use. And once you had a positive vasoreactivity test, how was it useful? It helps to predict that this patient may respond to nifedipine or one of the calcium channel blockers. Now, however, not everybody responds in that group. Even if you have a positive vasoreactivity test, so by the way, in all, if you do 100 patients idiopathic PAH, only 10 to 15% of them would show reactivity. Almost 85% of them will not show any reactivity. And even in the 10 to 15%, only 50% of them will respond to calcium antagonist. Therefore, out of 100 patients, you probably will have only 7 or 8 patients who would eventually respond to calcium channel blockers. But then in a disease like idiopathic PAH, even if 78% patients develop a good response to nifedipine, it's very welcome, and therefore it is still part of the recommendation to do vasoreactivity test. Then they also found, why don't we use it in Eisenmenger syndrome? Why don't we use the same reactivity test in congenital heart disease and pulmonary arterial hypertension? And they found that it has a correlation with medium time survival in Eisenmenger syndrome. So the next question came up, why don't we use the same vasoreactivity test for predicting operability? Suppose you have a vasoreactive test positive in a VSD case, so maybe we should be considered operable. It should be considered as a reversible PAH. However, all the initial attempts to predict operability from this sort of vasoreactivity criteria was not associated with any improvement in results. It could not predict survival after surgery, and therefore the reactivity test has undergone some changes. Now, a number of drugs have been used. Initially, oxygen was used, or one of these drugs, isoprene, adenosine. But more recently, nitric oxide or oxygen plus nitric oxide become the norm. And even more predictable than nitric oxide may be intravenous sildenafil. So currently in India, if you do not have any of these, the only thing available is oxygen. If available, nitric oxide and or intravenous sildenafil should be used for reactivity test. However, the criteria for using in congenital heart disease is slightly different, and this is something important for you to know and for you to remember. What determines operability in congenital heart disease? There are only two factors. One is the age of the patient, and even age, the younger the age, prevent pulmonary arterial hypertension, that is the best solution for congenital heart disease, pulmonary hypertension. Of course, how young depends also upon the lesion. For example, most complex heart disease and ventricular septal defect and aorta pulmonary central defect are best operated when they are less than 1 year old. Some of them even before the 6 months of age. If you have an atrial septal defect, maybe you can wait for a few years. So, however young possible, is possible to operate in your center, that is the correct treatment for preventing and treating pulmonary arterial hypertension. The second variable is you must have a low pulmonary vascular resistance. So what do you mean by low? If you have a pulmonary vascular resistance less than 6 units, the patient can be considered as operable. If you have a patient with pulmonary vascular resistance is more than 10 units, definitely the patient is not operable. There is no need to do any more tests. If you have less than 6, is operable. If you have more than 10, is inoperable. In between is a borderline zone. 6 to 10 is the one where you need reactivity test. Here there is no need for reactivity test. Here there is no need for reactivity test. This group of patients need reactivity. Once you do a reactivity, the criteria for reactivity in congenital heart disease is different from what you use for idiopathic PAH. It's not the same. The current concept is the pulmonary resistance should fall by 20%. The resistance of pulmonary artery to resistance in systemic circuit, the ratio should also fall by 20%. And the final PVRI should be less than 6 units. And the final RP by RS ratio should be less than 0.3. Now it is not that one of these criteria, all these 4 criteria have to be fulfilled. One is fall in resistance by 20%, fall in RP by RS, pulmonary resistance by systemic ratio by 20%, or final PVRI by 6, less than 6 units, or final RP by RS less than 0.3. All 4 criteria have to be fulfilled before you can consider the patient as operable. Now, if these criteria are not fulfilled, please remember that the current vasodilator therapy can only temporarily relieve symptoms. They can only defer worsening. There is absolutely no evidence that current medical treatment, either pre-surgery or post-surgery, can reverse pulmonary vascular disease. There is no evidence, except for the small pilot study from Japan who claimed that aggressive therapy may reverse it in a small selected group of patients. There is absolutely no evidence that pre-treatment or post-treatment with pulmonary vasodilators will reverse advanced pulmonary vascular disease. Therefore, if the resistance is more than 10 units or between 6 to 10 and showing no signs of reactivity, it's much better to leave the patient without operation. Now, even if the patient shows a positive reactivity test, please do not forget these 2 factors. If a patient is less than 2 years and he shows reactivity, accept the reactivity test positive. If the patient is 25 years old and somebody has said it's reactivity positive, please do not accept for surgery. Age is one of the most important predictors. If the patient has already reached adulthood and he shows a high PVR, even if it's shown to be reversible, it's very unlikely that he will be operable. If you close that defect, he will only deteriorate. And never forget the clinical picture. Clinical picture must suggest that the patient has large pulmonary blood flow. The only factor which you can correct in order to cure pulmonary arterial hypertension is to reduce the pulmonary flow. If the pulmonary blood flow is 10 liters per minute, you bring it down to normal of 3 liters per minute. That is the only thing which helps to prevent ventilation. Therefore, never, whatever cath data, whatever reactivity reports anybody may show you, never forget the age of the patient, never forget the clinical picture of it. What do I mean by clinical picture? This is what I mean. Clinical picture, there are certain clues to what is reversible pulmonary hypertension, what is irreversible pulmonary hypertension. Reversible pulmonary hypertension means the patient has a large left to right shunt. Therefore, the patient generally will have difficulty in feeding, failure to thrive, tachypnea, he will have frequent respiratory infection, he will have very poor weight gain, and so on. He has the symptoms of typical of increased pulmonary blood flow. He would have every sign of heart failure and increased pulmonary blood flow, like very active precordium, very brisk pulse, very labored respiration with intercostal recession, systolic murmurs with loud flow murmurs, but diastolic flow murmurs. He would not be desaturated. Saturation would be 95%, and very important to show that on simple exercise, his saturation would not drop to below 90%. If a person has 95% at rest and on walking for a couple of times down the corridor, if his saturation drops less than 90%, whatever be his cath data, he cannot be accepted for surgery. So exercise saturation is one of the most useful predictors of inoperability. Okay, X-ray I will discuss in the next slide. And of course, if you have evidence of left ventricular hypertrophy, deep Q wave, these are and left atrial enlargement, these are evidences of large pulmonary blood flow. On the other hand, if the patient is very asymptomatic or no symptoms or very mildly symptoms, he's not at all having any heart failure, no failure to thrive, no respiratory signs, looks very well preserved and stable, be very suspicious. A very stable patient with VSD means he is likely to be not operable. He is likely to have severe inoperable PAH. If you have a very quiet precordium, if you have no precordial activity, if you have no thrills, no diastolic murmurs, very quiet murmurs or no murmurs at all, that indicate the pulmonary blood flow is very low, is very likely to be irreversible PAH. If the resting saturation is low and if it falls with exercise, again, patient is not welcome for surgery. And of course, ECG evidence of RVH. If you have LVH and left atrial enlargement, it's likely to be operable. If you have RVH and right atrial enlargement, clear-cut case of inoperable PAH. So even though he may not be Eisenmenger comes only when cyanosis appears. He may be acyanotic but still be inoperable. Now these are 4 X-rays which will tell you what operability is. You have a patient with reactive, somebody says, look, you got a high PVR of 8 units, but I did a reactivity test and the PVR came down to 3 units, and he brings you this X-ray. This X-ray is certainly not compatible with surgery. You see a hugely dilated main pulmonary artery, hugely dilated right pulmonary artery, and marked pruning. Hardly any vessel is seen in the periphery. The heart size is normal. So whatever be the catheter, whatever be the reactivity test, X-ray of this type indicates inoperable finding. On the other hand, X-ray of this type, where you have huge heart, cardiomegaly, markedly enlarged left atrium, markedly enlarged right atrium, severe plethora in the lungs. Now in this patient, I don't even need PVR. I don't need PVR at all. This patient is operable. Whatever you tell me, this patient is operable. Sorry. This patient is operable. Now this patient might need a little more assessment. The pulmonary artery is little unusually dilated. So you might do a cardiac catheterization and reactivity test. But then I think this patient should still be operable because the pulmonary vasculature is quite increased. And this is an example of what? Can somebody tell me? Come on, guys. I just want to know whether you're awake or sleeping. This is an example of pulmonary venous hypertension.
pH.
No. Idiopathic pH will be crystal clear in the lungs. The lungs will be clear. This is pulmonary edema. This is post-capillary pulmonary hypertension. This is Eisenmenger or idiopathic PAH. This is large shunt operable PAH. This is large shunt probably operable PAH. This is post-capillary pulmonary hypertension. Look at the interstitial edema. Whole lung is in pulmonary edema, hazy lung. You can't make out the pulmonary artery at all. This is frank pulmonary edema, interstitial edema. This could be due to severe pulmonary venous obstruction or even TAPVC with obstruction, pulmonary vein obstruction, or it could be due to obstruction, severe mitral stenosis, mitral atresia, whatever it is. But it is post-capillary pulmonary hypertension. So the point I am making again and again is, don't go by cath alone. Cath is only one number. You have to remember the age of the patient. You have to remember the clinical condition of the patient, whether he suggests large pulmonary flow or less pulmonary flow. You have to remember the physical sign, whether the active precordium, cardiomegaly, loud murmurs, diastolic flow murmur or not. You have to remember the saturation, saturated or not. Saturation falls with exercise or not. ECG evidence of left heart enlargement or right heart enlargement. And X-ray evidence of plethora, or is it only pulmonary arterial hypertension, or is it pulmonary venous hypertension? If you take all these three factors into account, then PVR is one more factor. So you take age, you take clinical condition, you take X-ray, ECG and PVR. Then decide operability, not on PVR alone. Understood?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, that's the message I want to give you. So I think I'll stop here. So I've tried to give you a overall update and overview of idiopathic PAH, congenital heart disease PAH. If there are any questions, you are most welcome to ask me. Otherwise, I will, I'll wait for your question. But the next step would be probably I'm going to do one more session in which I hope to do some interactive cases of pulmonary arterial hypertension. Right? Is there any questions? You're most welcome to ask. I opened the chat box. Any questions there? No, not a single question in the chat box.
Sir, one question.
Yes. Identify yourself and then talk.
Sir, I'm Dr. Saurabh Kapadia from Mumbai.
From?
From Mumbai, Jaslok Hospital.
Mumbai. Okay. Which hospital in Mumbai?
Jaslok Hospitals.
Yeah. So how is Jaslok in COVID?
So right now situation okay, sir, under control.
Okay.
At Jaslok.
Okay, go ahead.
Sir, patients who have mitral stenosis and very significant pulmonary arterial hypertension, we often see that those patients recover after that pulmonary arterial pressure comes down after the operation. So, sir, what mechanisms underlie that they recover after the?
Well, that's a question which I think I don't know the answer, and I don't think anybody knows the answer. For some reason, when you have post-capillary pulmonary hypertension, the arterial changes seems to be reversible. It may be, as I said in the very first slide, there's one slide between congenital heart disease and idiopathic PAH, I showed you some differences. So whenever there is post-capillary pulmonary hypertension, it always starts as a passive hypertension. Passive means LA pressure is high, so the pulmonary vein pressure is high, so the pulmonary capillary pressure is high, so the pulmonary artery pressure is high. So initially it starts as a passive pulmonary hypertension up to a certain extent. And then after a certain level of pulmonary hypertension, the pulmonary arterioles start constricting, and then you have an added element of arterial constriction. So you have two levels of obstruction. One is at the left atrial level and another is at the pulmonary arterial level. But the initial obstruction is passive. Now that is different from idiopathic PAH. Idiopathic PAH and congenital heart disease, the passive PAH is not there. It starts as a primarily arterial disease. Now, so that is the only hemodynamic difference between the two. Etiology wise, still people are working. Some people believe it may be due to some genetic, the idiopathic PAH, the proliferation of the tissue is all monoclonal. They all belong to one cell line. So it may be triggered proliferation of one particular cell line which causes arterial occlusion in idiopathic PAH. Whereas congenital heart disease is a different type, or mitral stenosis is a different type where it starts passively and arterial obstruction is only secondary, which is reversible. So having said that, since I do not know the exact mechanism, but in mitral stenosis and left heart disease, if you are able to treat the left heart disease, the pulmonary hypertension is reversible. But then don't expect it to reverse on the same day. because when you relieve mitral stenosis by a balloon or surgery, you relieve only the passive part of the pulmonary hypertension. You are not relieving the active part of the pulmonary hypertension. That is the arterial part, arterial constriction, you are not relieving. Therefore, the arterial part will take many weeks or months to resolve. Therefore, the patient of severe pulmonary hypertension due to left heart disease, even though you have treated the left heart disease, may not improve immediately on the same day. He will continue to be unstable and gradually improve over several weeks or several months. That is why even mitral valve disease, when you do a MVR, patients often are stuck on the ventilator for 2 days, 3 days, and then gradually they come. They remain unstable. Even mitral stenosis patient, the moment you open the mitral valve, they feel better, but their PAH never comes down to normal. Okay, have I answered your question?
Thank you, sir. Yes.
Mhm.
Sir, is there what is the particular role of anticoagulation in idiopathic cases?
I told you. In fact, I talked about it. One, if you have any doubt of thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, it's a must. Even if you have not been able to prove it, if you have a doubt, you must give it. In idiopathic PAH, as such, in the earlier stages, there is no indication. If you're from CT pulmonary angio and if your VQ scan are normal, but at an advanced stage, when the pulmonary artery is aneurysmally dilated, or when the right heart is dilated with heart failure, or when the right atrium is dilated with heart failure, secondary thrombosis and embolism is very common. In fact, one of the common mechanisms of death in pulmonary artery hypertension, one is of course sudden cardiac death, second is arrhythmia, third is hemorrhage, and fourth one is massive pulmonary thrombosis. Because the blood flow is so sluggish in the pulmonary artery that the blood clots. Therefore, anticoagulation may be helpful in a sick patient with pulmonary arterial hypertension, even though thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension was not the original cause. Okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
But if you have any doubt about thromboembolism, you must give from the beginning.
Okay, sir.
Right. Any other question in the chat box? Where's the chat box gone? Yeah, somebody has typed something. Young patient with PVR less than 3 units, NYHA class 2. No, you are asking for idiopathic for shunt with PAH. You are asking? No,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
No, you are asking an 18-year-old person and a 50-year-old person. You're asking.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. What will be the approach like?
Okay. If you have suppose you have got a VSD or ASD, and you have an 18-year-old man with PVR less than 3 units, and he has got PAH and the PVR less than 3 units, you have not told me the size of the shunt. If he has a significant left to right shunt more than 2:1, he should definitely undergo closure. If he has the same 2:1 shunt at 50 years of age, he should also undergo closure. 50 years is no bar for surgery. It's only the PVR which is a bar for surgery. If you, it's the same thing. If in a 50-year-old you tell me the PVR was 7 units, I did a reactivity test and I brought it down to 4 units. So please operate. I won't operate.
Okay, sir.
You understand the difference?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So basically,
if a 50-year-old has a large shunt, I will operate at rest. If a 50-year-old has high PVR and you showed me the reactivity is there, that's why you should operate, then I won't operate.
Okay, sir. So shunt also will go on. So
Shunt
overall
important and the basal PVR is important. Basal PVR is 8 units. Means a young patient basal PVR 8 units comes back to 3 units, I can operate. But old patient basal PVR 8 units and you have shown comes back to 4 units, I will be very, very hesitant to operate.
Okay, sir. Okay. So
any other questions?
So as in your no sir. So as you know, slides are all the factors should be considered, right from
Yes,
the
yes.
saturation,
It's a
age, everything.
yes.
Everything.
It's a multifactorial disease and it's a multifactorial decision.
Yes.
Age has to be considered. The size of the left to right hand has to be considered. Clinical picture has to be considered. ECG, X-ray, everything, and finally PVR.
Okay, sir. Okay. Yes.
Any other question?
No, sir.
Okay. If how many people registered today?
Sir, around 80 people were there, sir.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, then I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Tuesday, I
Thank you,
will.
sir.
Tuesday, if possible, I'll put together some slides for a interactive session. Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.